Hi, and welcome to Language Leaders Live. We are talking with three amazingly experienced individuals. They actually have a lot of experience, not only in language education, but also in an area that I'm just really fascinated about. It comes up a lot in the conversations we have with our LearnCube customers and prospects, but it's a lot around tenders and RFPs and how both technology and the pedagogy side of things fits into these tenders and winning business that can actually really make or break some of these businesses that we all run, certainly in the corporate language training space. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce you to the three we have on stage, and I'll introduce each one. We have Jeremy Frohlich. He is the COO of LRDG. It's the Language Research Development Group, and they have responded to and won literally hundreds of tenders over the years with a real focus on Canada and government within Canada. Secondly, we also have Federico Espinosa. He's the VP of Learning Design and Content Operations at Busuu, which is a Chegg service now. Fed is a Delta qualified English teacher who's now leads education at Busuu after 8 years also in EdTech. Inigo Lopez is our third panelist. He is the CEO of BiCortex Languages. Inigo also has a lot of experience, not only while he's been in the language space, but also in a previous life. So has a real understanding, particularly for the global mobility space, but I think all round has a really good understanding of tenders and RFPs. So we're in good company here. And thank you all for joining me here. And I'm going to jump with an initial question to you, Inigo, if I can. So what I was curious about was just to get a real overview and understanding of what's the general process of bidding, particularly for language contracts in the enterprise space. For myself, who's a bit newer to this and hasn't seen the full process, and certainly for some of those that are listening in.
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Alex, for organizing this. I'm very excited to be here. Well, there are many different kind of tenders, and when you talk about the corporate world, each company is free to do whatever they want. So they put a tender based on their criteria, and their processes as they wish. This is different from government that they have to follow the rules and the laws in each of the countries. So all the entities in the same country, they have to do it in the same place or on the same platform. So when it comes to corporate tenders, if we take the normal tender where you are asked to propose or to send your documents, and then after a while you get a winner. So the steps are the following. The initial step would be an optional step, which is an RFI, request for information. This is not mandatory, and in most cases, it doesn't happen. In my experience, this happens when it is the first time a company is going to do a tender about a specific product. So they want to understand better about the options that are out there in the market and so on. So a few companies are invited, and then the questions could be technical and also could be price-wise. And then after that, they launch the RFP. So then for enterprises, they normally invite their preferred suppliers or the companies that they know. If the companies are larger companies, they may have a portal where you can also register, and then you may get invited. Then I would say one of the most important parts of the RFP to me is the first few days after the day when you receive the invitation. Why? Because there is normally a deadline for questions. So you have to read all the documents in a question mode. So write down whatever it's not clear to you, and then check with your team. And then come with a nice list of questions, taking into account that the answers are normally public. So you can't really ask questions that are, you can't put your name, write your name there, or if there is an information that you want to ask, but then the answer is going to be good for the competitors, maybe you don't want to ask it. So there is where the game starts. But
and give away trade secrets. You have to be very creative with the questions.
Exactly. So then after the deadline of the questions, they normally the company would have a few days. Normally this is written, how many days they need to reply. And then you will get a document with all the questions of all the competitors and all the replies. And of course, you don't know who asked what, but you get a better feeling about some things that may be not very clear. Normally, if a tender is not well written, there will be many questions. If it's properly written, then there will be only a few questions. Then you have the proper deadline when you have to send all the information. Then after that, normally there is a short list number of companies that they move to the next phase. That normally it's a presentation. So it used to be a meeting, but nowadays everything is done online. So then for that part, you are asked additional questions or the same questions. They normally tell you in advance, and then you have to prepare that. And then we normally go a few of us to this meeting. And then on the side of the company, they also have people from procurement, technical, and sometimes IT for data security, and so on. And then after that, you may think that this is over, but you may have small part where there is further negotiation when you thought that you put the best price, and then sometimes say, okay, yeah, you are very good, but in these countries, for instance, or these languages, you are 20% higher. Well, that depends on how they do it, but basically it's time for negotiation. And then after that, and lots of effort sometimes, then you get the awarded, and then you sign the contract and so on. So that's basically more or less how most RFPs work.
There's a lot more to it than I thought. That's excellent. I've kept this on the screen deliberately as well, Jeremy, because I was wondering if you would kind of add anything, particularly from, first of all, does this align with your own experience? And then secondly, is that how often government contracts tend to work?
It is pretty much a carbon copy. It's a very good description. In our case, the RFI, request for information, as Inigo said, doesn't always lead to a contract, but we felt that was crucial. It's our time to kind of influence, if you will. The RFI, you don't just respond to it as is. It really is the government asking for information from the private sector. And that's where we write in, that's where we critique, that's where we suggest a better way. We're a bit naive. We hope that translates perfectly into the RFP, but it doesn't always. But that's where we start our selling process, if you will. And then when we get the RFP, again, very specific to what Inigo said, but hyper specific to the Canadian government. In our case, we have data security, regulatory. 90% of the RFP are those types of stuff that you have to comply with. A smaller portion, but very important, is the statement of work, is the mandatory criteria. Those are deal breakers. We review the mandatory criteria 100 times, and we go down that list and make sure we're 100% compliant, no ifs, ands, or buts. Then we have a point-rated criteria, where you're awarded different points depending on how compliant you are. And then we go by, pretty obviously, by order of largest items. We make sure we're getting top points, by going down the list. And then I wanted to add to Inigo again, the question period is crucial for us. We ask anything and everything we can. It not only can lead and influence again and potentially even change the wording, it helps us if we were to be awarded the contract down the road. We referred to questions that we had asked and said, hey, as you remember, we suggested a better way. So all of these things are long-winded. There is no guarantee. You said it, they make or break the company. In our case, they have absolutely made it for us. We would not be where we are without RFPs, but it's also hitting your head against the wall at the same time, if I'm being honest. They're tough.
What sort of, and maybe I can ask both, and then also I'll get Fed if you can kind of add also from a pedagogical side, because you have to have collaboration from the team clearly with so many different stakeholders on the company or the government side coming in. Naturally, it sort of filters through to you inside the team. But how long does this typically last? Inigo, and then I'll ask Jeremy the same question.
I think we have to follow the deadlines of the RFP. So if you have 1 week, it will last 1 week. It's very
so they
rare
can be
that
very quick.
Not like 1 day, but yeah, it could be 1 week or something like that. So
wow.
But it doesn't happen. I mean, at least in our company, that we never send our proposal like 3 days in advance. It's always on the very same day, or maybe 1 day before if we are really lucky.
Yeah.
Same for us.
So you also see this as well, Jeremy?
Yeah, the turnaround time is a little bit of a tell. If there's a 2-week period for this RFP to come down, in our case, if we're not already in touch with them, we actually know that it's earmarked for somebody. The RFP could be 2 things. It could be to help them make a decision, but it could also be to justify the paperwork, to justify the contract. They know who they want, but they have to put this full-fledged RFP in place to officially award it to a supplier. So a 2-week turnaround, we won't even bother, especially if it's not written in our way. If we have 6 weeks, we'll jump in. But the turnaround time is one of those things.
Yeah, I would have thought 6 weeks to 12 weeks seems like a fairly good sign that this is an open RFP as opposed to someone that they just need to justify and push through the paperwork. Interesting. So then I'd like to ask you, Fed, when you've been involved through Busuu, and Busuu business is going really well on that side, you've also had to, I mean, you still need to be able to, this is language education that we're talking about in the end. So you need to justify certain things on a pedagogical perspective. How have you felt that? And what are you exposed to?
Yeah, so I mean, echoing both the finding that Jeremy and Inigo shared, it is these longer RFPs. Those are the ones where my team tends to get involved. Working within the education department at Busuu, we collaborate quite closely with the B2B sales team, and we work actually in having our own dedicated corporate learning team in-house. However, we don't tend to hear about the 2-week long RFPs because at that point, our input isn't as relevant. The sales team's well trained on what the product is. They can deliver those. It's in the back and forth in the question and the presentation stages where there are various requirements on the side of the company where we actually do get involved and get into the needs analyses of what it is that the company is looking for as sort of the pedagogical result of what they're looking to buy.
Yeah.
And, with the case of Busuu as well, often what we can deliver is some amount of customized content or bespoke content to their needs. Either in sort of pre-established industry content or working with them directly. And depending on the size of the deal, that often is one of these longer 12-week long processes where we do even sometimes begin some of the preliminary work to show, even as far as showing a prototype of what we could build for them if we were to be successful.
Fantastic. So you've kind of indicated a few things that tends to kind of come through your department. So customizing content, I guess that is in response to how much do you personalize the learning for the user. Is that right? Are there any other kind of pedagogical areas that come in those Q&As?
To me, from my perspective as an educator, there's also the element of, are we the best fit for this company? I know that there are, as a company, we want to make sure that when we get the deal, that we actually are able to deliver on that deal.
Yeah.
And so to a certain extent, part of my role in these RFPs, or my team's role in these RFPs in these question stages, is to check what they're looking for and whether we actually are able to deliver that, and if so, how. So just like both Jeremy and Inigo said, you learn about what their needs are and you're able to deliver to that. But we do that from the pedagogical side at seeing whether they want live lessons, whether they want only self-study, how many licenses, and even often what the expectations are in terms of progress.
Are they very clear on how they want a certain outcome? So, for example, you alluded to having live lessons and maybe some self-study. Do they often say, hey, we want these 2 things, or are they like, we want get this group of people from this point to this point, and then it's up to the bidders to kind of suggest how they might go about that? Or what do you think?
From my perspective, and I'm curious actually to hear what Jeremy and Inigo have to say on this one, but from my perspective, it's the companies who are looking to move on from an existing provider who usually have a wish list, and it tends to be a wish list based on what they're unhappy with their current offering. Some companies do come with a much more open, I would say most companies come with a much more open, we would like to progress learners in this language. And roughly they might come with timeframes, but not always. Sometimes they ask us for the timeframes. But either way, when there is a very definite wish list, I find that it's often in response to having been disappointed in the past by something else.
Jeremy or Inigo, how have you found that in terms of how open or requiring are these contracts around the pedagogical and learning outcomes?
In our case, it's tough. We are selling in the RFP process because they don't ask for what we have. They don't ask for an online system. They don't ask for progress tracking. They're not expecting to pay top dollar for it. So we're a premium provider in our case. They ask for what's in the Canadian government, you have levels. I'm sure it's applicable, common European framework or whatever, getting learners from A to B, B to C with a set number of hours at a set price. And in the past, it was entirely price-led. They would just pick the cheapest supplier. That obviously didn't work. Now it's more looking at value, more looking at outcome. But the RFPs are sometimes shells, carbon copies of what they've used in the past. They didn't necessarily like their previous supplier, but they're reusing the same RFP to pick a new supplier. So similar outcome happening. It's on us to really showcase, and this is part of the question period. We say, are you open to a self-directed methodology? Would you be open to this? We actually try to get them to change the RFP. Again, we try to get it to write it with them in advance through the RFI process, but it's tough. If you have 2 weeks to turn around, they're asking for a box, which is an hourly price. You're up against, it's a difficult situation to be in.
So it seems like the RFI is the best opportunity to educate the buyer in that way, because that's before they've put it all together. Is that right? Or how else can you educate value? Because for me, I'm totally on the same area. Like, value is what you want to be selling, not price. Otherwise you tend to go down to the bottom. So
I would personally say good old-fashioned sales. The RFI is still a document. It's still, you have to spend weeks writing a large document. Good old-fashioned sales. You do meet buyers who say, thanks, we're not interested. We'll go to RFP next year. We'll push back and we'll say, great, we'll help you in that RFP. Take a look at what we have, what works, previous statement of works from previous RFPs, which cut out the work for you. You can now publish this and your RFP is written. So we still work with them and don't kind of just accept that RFP is I don't want to say an excuse, but you know what I mean, as the easy way out sometimes. We'll still showcase what we have, understanding there's no commitment, understanding there are some buyers that claim they're not allowed to do that, but we push hard for just exploring what we have before the RFP or RFI process.
Go for it, Inigo.
In our case, we provide most kind of services that students may need. So from face-to-face, virtual with the teacher, and also self-paced. And the thing is that before COVID, it was easier because there were companies, they were saying, okay, I like face-to-face, that's fine. They do that. And then the students or the employees, they would take face-to-face because that was in the policy. Or other companies, they would say, no, I want virtual, online. And then same thing. So it was very clear. After COVID, now it's a mess. Because even if they know or they think they know, then the employees will decide something different. So we recently won an RFP that basically it was face-to-face lesson with a private teacher anywhere in Europe. That could be in company or at home, but it could be also at a school in any capital of Europe, like close to the place where they were living, but they didn't know where they were living yet because they were going to move. Or it could be also online or self-paced. So basically everything, and you only you could only put like one price. So it's really complicated, and it's not their fault. It's like nowadays, whatever you get out of the RFP, they may ask for different things, and differently to before COVID. Now companies are flexible. So if someone says, I want virtual, even if my policy says face-to-face, or the other way around, the companies now tend to say, okay, go ahead. So I think it's becoming very difficult now in that sense. I don't know if you agree, Jeremy and Fed.
Yeah, there's a lot of nods there. I mean, one thing that seems very clear that these are, in a way, they're calculated risks, and reading what RFPs are coming out is part of that game. If I'm understanding things right, certainly things that are short turnaround, they give you a good nod that maybe not worth attending. But I guess you're trying to go for the ones that you've got the highest chance of getting over the line, which also means that pre-sale and pre-relationship aspect. How do you find that, Jeremy? And I was going to ask, is it sort of, you were kind of nudging on that question before, but this sense of distance that those that make the RFPs may want to have, they're like, oh no, we want to keep that professional distance, but it's against your interest, certainly, and sometimes maybe against their own interest to keep that distance. What's your take on that?
Tough question. It's so specific to the Canadian government for us, but it's maybe marketing and branding, and you're showing who you are and you're showing that you're legitimate. So when you push back, it comes with that validation in a way. And then we do, as Inigo mentioned, you have to be careful with questions, but we do share that this is in use across other clients, across other departments, and they're free to kind of explore with them and seek references. So, you know what I mean? It's really a dynamic process, the RFP. We don't just respond to the boxes as is in their time frame. We're trying to establish ourselves without being arrogant or anything, but we're trying to establish ourselves as experts, quite frankly, as better experts than the buyers. The buyers don't know what to look for. They don't know what's out there. We do our competitive analysis. We're ready to give them all of that, right? With no catch type of thing. So we showcase that. We try to bring value through and through the entire process. If push comes to shove, we do consider responding just to put our name in, just to get there, because of course, if we don't win, there's a debrief period. So they open their doors eventually to the suppliers and they talk to you. We'll build our relationships that way. Frankly, it has happened that midway through the contract that they've chosen somebody else, they'll actually ask us for a trial because of all that. So if it's last minute, if we can't win and the price tag is worth it, we'll still respond. We'll still go through the legwork, and often there's something to gain from it. If anything, if nothing else, other than to genuinely learn and get better in different areas, but if not, to build a relationship for the future.
Just to get a rough idea, how long are these? I know that there's a piece of string kind of question this, but I think there might be some kind of level of how long these contracts typically last for. Is it, if I was to hazard a guess, I would be thinking, 2 to 3 years would be my thought, unless somebody else has any. I mean,
in our case, they're typically 3 years, and then there's something called an option year. So they can exercise an additional year, no questions asked, if all goes well. So up to 5 years.
I'm just thinking, even with LearnCubes, you're in 3 years tends to go by quite quickly, and that knowledge, from 3 years ago probably comes in handy. So I really like that idea of apply for more than you might think you get, because you'll learn a lot more about when that comes around the next time. Very interesting. I was going to just also share a little bit of my own experience with RFPs and tenders. We only really see it from the technical side. We'll have one of our customers ask us around the technical requirements, and we tend to sort of see them fall into a number of buckets. It seems, and again, it'll be interesting from you, Jeremy, just on whether anything's so different. My experience is probably more European based rather than North American, but we do have customers that have asked us similarly. But certainly around where the data is stored and processed is like number one, seemingly, particularly if it's a government contract. I think that's starting to become more and more so. I'm curious on Canada there, because the US is a bit all over the show, but Europeans seem very clear that they want their servers and their data inside of Europe. We get questions really around, of course, security. Some of the ways that you can, and I think part of it is having a good hygiene. That's obviously what they're looking for. And so they'll have lots of questions about how do you make sure that your processes are secure, and how do you keep those processes secure. They'll want to make sure that access is restricted and those sorts of things. But then, we do work with AWS's, just like many businesses are using cloud software. I think fortunately, some of those businesses solve a lot of those problems. Like they'll want to see, do you have physical security around your data center? It's like, well, we deliberately don't own or run our own data center, but we use services that do. Then I think we also see Yeah, I talked about security hygiene, but vulnerabilities, they want to see penetration tests, for example, often come up in a lot of those questions. How about you three? Have any experience in terms of the technical requests and requirements?
You mentioned the data processing and storage. One of the other aspects we've had with data privacy, particularly with Europe and particularly with some governments, like in Germany, is the fact that there's actually quite a lot of protections for employees in a company where there's a learning service offered in terms of whether their manager should be allowed to see their progress and see whether they're using the product or not. So there have been a lot of requirements based on privacy laws or employee protection laws that we have to be sensitive to and possibly adapt our management platform outputs in order to be able to comply with that German company's need to anonymize and keep employee study information away from their manager to avoid any shadow of a doubt that the manager might make decisions based on that. That's definitely one factor that we've come across, not just for Germany, but that's one notable example I can think of.
It's also an interesting, nice friction point, isn't it, Fed, where you actually have sometimes companies pushing, as corporate language training providers, pushing for more visibility of how the learners are going, whereas on the other side, you've got privacy issues literally pushing against that very request and wish list.
Yeah, and it does require you to build for both because you have both extremes and RFPs that really require one end or the other of that spectrum.
Yeah, very interesting.
I have something to share because sometimes we are asked to be global, and then on the other side they ask to have all the data and everything that must be treated in the EU. So we had this RFP where this wasn't for language training; it was for translations, and it was mandatory on the RFP that everything needed to be done in Europe, in the EU. So, of course, some of the translators that we have in the US that could help us for this project, we couldn't use them at all. And even some of our employees, they are just, we had to create special aliases to remove them so that they couldn't see anything related to this project because they are based in the Americas and so on. So, sometimes it goes to really to the limit, but then on the other side, once the project is ongoing, they do whatever they want. So sometimes they send like private information without encryption over email. So you wonder like, okay, you ask me all these things, and then you're on the team, you do the other way around, or even sometimes the manager or the CEO doesn't know things that their team are perfect in terms of data, and then you find out that they don't. So it's quite funny how they push us to the limit in terms of data security policies, penetration tests, and so on. And then in real life, they are far away many times from that.
I think that draws on something I found really difficult is the cherry pick problem where, and I think you kind of alluded to it, Jeremy, where you're kind of reusing an RFP, but then you just add onto it, just keep on adding more and more obscure things. Particularly, one of their security people goes to a conference, they're like, oh yeah, we should add that to the RFP, and you're like, and it can really create some big hurdles, I think, for you as providers. How do you, are there any parts of that process where you can push back or have a more rounded answer rather than a yes or no?
Yeah, we overdo it. We don't just say yes or understood or met. We do go over and beyond, and we'll share screenshots and we'll refer back to those screenshots numerous times. We'll really kind of overdo it in these responses. We'll give them things that they're not always asking for or aware of. Kind of like what Inigo suggested. You give it 200%, knowing full well that they don't expect all of that and won't themselves comply with everything that they're asking for. So we now have a shell of a statement of work that's in use across enterprise clients across the Canadian government. And these are very known standards with regards to data security, regulatory. We're actually in the IT space. We're not in the language, in the teaching space. They put us in the IT box. So it's crazy rigorous. And so we reuse all of those best practices. I wish they would add newer, modern things as it comes up, frankly, because that's progression. But they tend to reuse a lot of the same, stuff over the years.
Interesting. I was wondering, Fed, what are the main misconceptions you've sort of found, though, when it comes to RFPs, whether that be, other people in your team, or it could even be on the company side of what they're trying to do?
I think some of the challenges we face, and again, speaking from my perspective as the education input into these processes, it's often the assumptions that come from the decision makers about what is possible. It's a little bit of kind of having expectations that might seem unreasonable about, well, these people need to be fluent in French in 3 months. Can you do that? And they sort of put that question out there, and it almost seems as if the way to succeed on this RFP is to find a way to say that, yes, somebody could become fluent in French in 3 months. But the real answer is realistically unlikely for that to be possible for a number of learning reasons.
Yeah.
So there are some misconceptions sometimes in terms of what is possible and what is reasonable to expect from a writer. A good chunk of that is actually then answered in that process and in presentations where we can discuss what the opportunities are and what the fast track could look like. But I would say that's one of the bigger ones that come across is what is technically possible or technically possible in terms of pedagogy.
Yeah, there's also kind of like what they want versus what they should want. I think that's sort of the hard one. Excellent.
But if I can add, it really scares me to say no.
Yeah.
Because once you have this question, it's too late. Like the RFI, it's gone, so you can't change that. The question is there, and if for any reason they have in their internal discussions, whoever says no to this one, it's out. Then you may be out for something that you could have potentially replied yes, or done the necessary internally in the company to make it happen. Like sometimes we've had some questions about invoicing in India or something like that, and it may be something that you would normally say no, I can't. But maybe if you think twice, maybe you think, okay, I can go through a partner or something like that, and then you are able to invoice, so you can reply yes. So yeah, I'm really scared of saying no, and of course sometimes we have to say no, but yeah, we have to be very careful and at least always explain why, as Jeremy said.
Just out of curiosity, I kind of alluded to it first. It wasn't always clear depending on the questions as well. Sometimes the question is really long, and so I'm just kind of curious. Do you tend to be like yes, 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 or are you like yes and explanation when you're often that's at least how I've been provided it. This kind of these questions before. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I mean, my example was a bit extreme, but I think often the answer is no, but. So I know that the questions might be something about a specific type of content, and we offer something quite similar. So we'll say yes, and what we actually offer is this. I know that that's often how the conversations between. So I'm the person in my RFP process that ends up telling the sales team we really should say no to that because we really can't. And there is a bit of this conversation. I think Inigo and I would have this back and forth about, well, we don't want to say no, so how can we say yes and also, stand on sort of integrity that we do deliver if this goes through. And there is often the questions are much more nuanced, and we're able to deliver how our yes is a yes but to what they're actually asking.
Yeah. How about you, Jeremy? Is there a yes and? Sometimes I think yes and is a good one. Yes, we can do it, and actually, this is a much better way of approaching the same problem. Maybe not too, but I totally understand where you and Inigo are coming from, Fed.
Yeah, same for us. You definitely don't want to just say no. We are not compliant. That ends there. Oftentimes, if you don't have exactly what they're asking for, but of course we're biased, we own our own companies, but we believe we have a better way that gives them what they want. So that no, but, and then kind of justifying a better way. Again, it works sometimes. And then same thing with the yes. Yes, we have this, but it doesn't end there. And see proof and see screenshots and refer to appendix. And it's just, really, frankly speaking, I don't know if this ever will go public, but there's 100 pages to our response. We don't always think that every page is getting read, if I'm being really just honest here. But the more meat to it, the more paper, the more answers, gives more justification for a decision. So that's the way that we do it. We really overdo it and give them everything possible to make the right decision.
I have a question for you two, or you three actually. I think we fully agree that we have to say no, but, or yes, and. So we have to always try to explain things. But sometimes, especially if you can reply in a freestyle, so you just send a PDF, you could write pages and pages and pages of stuff. But sometimes if you talk too much about things that are not really related, maybe that's too much, or maybe not. So do you tend to just add as much as you can think you could add, or sometimes you say, okay, we have to really make a shorter answer on, I don't know, like half a page per question, or 1 page, something like that?
There's definitely an element of overdoing it. You don't want to add stuff out of left field. We'll just be very thorough on that question, on that point. And really, like, you know, we could have maybe answered that question in half the time, but we'll really drive that home, especially if it's an important question. But yeah, there's an element of the way they have the bid criteria. There's price, there's value, there's technical criteria, and then there is, you know, not credibility, what's it called? Legibility, how it's read, how it's understood. They'll remove points if there's typos and if you're kind of out of left field. So there is an orthographe, as we say, or a writing component to it too.
Yeah, I wonder if you kind of, I imagine you're somewhat selling even there, right? Like if it's super full of waffle, then I guess that kind of, they might, am I right though? It kind of gives me the impression of a certain stereotype. It's just somebody is more looking for ways to say no so they can shorten the pile rather than ways to say yes. How do you sort of, what's your avatar of these people, Jeremy, in the government sector?
It's a good question. Tricky, but sometimes they don't know what's out there. So it is legitimate. Just let's see what we have. Let's read RFP responses for the next 6 months and figure it out. Sometimes it is absolutely a way to just kind of, we know who we want. We're going to write requirements for that company without that company's name. Sometimes that's us. Sometimes that's others. It depends. We do have our whole personas for the buyers, but oftentimes the buyers, I think Inigo touched on this, are behind the scenes. It's the procurement agents, the contracting folks that own the RFP. So in these questions, in that process, you're not even talking to the buyers. They're behind the scenes. And so the procurement agents will add their own requirements for data security and all that the buyers didn't want. So there's so many kind of vectors. It's a dynamic process, this RFP. It could be easy, it could be simple, it could lead to amazing contracts, it could be totally frustrating. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity then, how do you tend to figure out how much resource to kind of put towards these as well? Because a lot of us have businesses where you get incoming people and you also know who you're kind of looking for. This is a gamble every time you go for an RFP, much more so it seems than even just sort of a direct sale. How do you think about resource? Because otherwise you spend every single day, every single second going after RFPs. Any thoughts on this, Inigo and Jeremy in particular, since you're at the more the business side of things?
I think that there must be like the leader, that this person is the one reading every single document and then asking the questions and so on. And then depending on the company and on the people, there should be 2, 3, 4, 5 people writing part of the answers depending on their specialty. But then after that, then the person in charge needs to read everything and then add comments, and then potentially another person also add comments, whereas can we add, then proofreading a few times. So yeah, but you don't want to make, for instance, everyone involved in the RFP to read all the documents, because then if it takes 3 hours to read all the documents, then 3 hours times the number of people involved. So it's really a lot. So yeah, it's I guess each company is different, but you need to try to optimize the resources. But I would say that there needs to be one person who is leading the RFP. That's for sure, and only one person.
Alex, do you mean resources to respond to the RFP or
Yeah,
service delivery resources?
So already I can imagine that could be 1 to 10 people's full-time jobs, depending on how many RFPs you are. So either way, your size of company will dictate how many RFPs you're willing to go for. Unless I guess part of that question might be like knowing this is the niche that we feel that we can win in with RFPs and then going after that. But if you had anything further that sort of came to mind was interesting.
In our case, we're actually not as advanced as we should be using technology, using dedicated writers. It is frankly a free-for-all. It's a necessary free-for-all, but we'll see an RFP, and exactly as Inigo said, we'll throw the whole team at it. We'll divvy up parts of the RFP into different specialties. Of course, the pedagogical department, the accounting department, everybody provides their own respective responses, and it's just a 4-week kind of all hands on deck effort. That's our way of doing it, right? And then that's we should get better at it being so important to us, of course.
Excellent. Inigo, I was wondering how in Europe do you tend to find out about RFPs? And I'll ask the same question of you, Jeremy. Where are you finding out if there are RFPs, particularly this idea of like, not that you're probably wanting to go after these 2-week turnarounds, but even 6 weeks, that's got to be somewhere. How do I find it? So do you just tend to find people it's fairly obvious where to look, or what's your experience, Inigo? And then I'll ask you, Jeremy, on the same question.
Well, we're normally invited, so that means that we do a lot of work in advance. I think what Jeremy said about the writing the RFP and so on, this is the ideal world, but I think it's very difficult. I don't know how often you write part of RFPs, but I think it's very difficult. So in most cases, you're just invited. Some other cases, you know that you are not the provider, and then it's been the 4 years, so you expect that this is gonna be launched soon. So yeah, I would say that's the main. As I said before, with other normally larger companies, you may have a portal, so you can register, and then see if you are invited. And sometimes, by chance, you get to know an opportunity, and then you participate, and even you win. That happened to us recently. Nobody knew us in the company. We just got an email because they found us on the internet, I think, and then we ended up winning. So it's I think that there is no simple answer to that.
Okay, no, there's no websites are us. Come and get your tender here.
Yes, I mean.
Okay, Jeremy, unless
government, there definitely is. We are lucky. We are lucky. We have a handful of sites that are that's where the government buys everything. It's literally called Canada Buys, is the new one. There's known sites that we're registered in different categories. We'll actually position ourselves as professional services, as e-learning, as IT. So there's a lot of different categories, and of course we get some notifications that don't apply to us, but every week we'll get a list of open opportunities, and that's one angle. Of course, working hand in hand with buyers around their plans, as Inigo said, knowing, okay, 6 months from now their contract will expire, they're going to put out an RFP soon. RFPs are absolutely central to everything that we do, and we're lucky that the Canadian government puts it all in one simple place.
Inigo, I'm sure you wish for the same then.
Well, actually, every country is similar for government tenders, so you can do it everywhere. But for corporates, it's a different world.
One of the things I think we were talking a little bit about was on this balance between price and value. I just sort of wanted to dig a bit more into that, and as well, I mean, Jeremy, you mentioned talking about value and Fed as well. I was very interested how you can bring in the pedagogy side, which can sometimes be kind of left till, oh, by the way, we got this contract. Can you somehow deliver to these requirements? Maybe Fed, do you want to start off with how can you add value and show value through these RFPs from a pedagogical side?
So we do have the contracts that we engage with specific SLAs in terms of how many hours people will take to get through levels. And also we have sort of KPIs on that success of that contract. that can come out of those negotiations, looking at, progress in different ways. And a lot of what we deliver there is looking at ways that we can measure and deliver progress in language learning, because that is what we're at the end trying to sell. The fact that we at Busuu have been able to deliver on a couple of efficacy studies and actually be able to deliver on measurable studies with independent researchers that show progress actually do really enable us to make those promises and actually back them up with some research. But in terms of value, a lot there really is around how much value they can get from having our self-study platform, which is quite cheap, being just something that somebody can access on their own, and then balancing that against our live offering, which is at a premium, but then really comes with much higher gains from having the spoken interaction over video. Yeah. So there is definitely a balancing act from our sales team, leveraging those two pieces and finding the sweet spot for that RFP's chosen value.
Inigo, how about you? I mean, also, and nothing wrong with being a smaller company than Busuu, but when you're a smaller company, how do you find, like, for example, in LearnCube, service and kind of being able to be a partner is a big deal. How about from your perspective, how can you show extra value from what you do? I'm sure you can tick a lot of the same boxes, but you come from a different type of business to say a $500 million business.
Yeah, I mean, it always depends on how much you know about the company and about the buyer. So you need to really look for the part that could really ring a bell inside their mind and say, okay, I think this company is interesting. It could be things such as ESG, sustainability, or it could be things which are related to reports. Reporting is becoming more and more important. Then of course, when you're talking about self-paced, then the platform itself, it's really what will define which one they prefer. But I mean, this is just some examples. I think you have to look at your company from A to Z and then see which part is more interesting, like even like where you are from. So if it's a tender done by a European company, try to be European. If it's a US tender, try to be American. Bring the people that are from the same country as the people doing the tender to the final meeting. So these kind of small things may give you a small advantage, but sometimes this makes you win.
Yeah, great. How about you, Jeremy? What are you thinking around sort of value?
My case is eerily similar to Federico. It sounded like he was talking about my company in the way that we position ourselves. So where that starts is in the question period. So the RFP will come with a pricing grid, hourly price. And we'll actually ask a question: are you open to a price? Are you open to modifying the pricing grid to reflect a software license, even a pedagogical support? There's so many components, and we call it play gymnastics with the response. We could package it, we could different, but what we don't want is to just be compared alongside another competitor hourly. So we never want that. So we'll ask that question, and then sometimes the response will be, no, we're not changing the price. We're not changing the grid. Simply put your hourly price. We know that there's very low chances of winning that. Sometimes they'll actually change the box. Great. They'll actually add a new template that they'll post, that they'll publish out, and we can respond to it. Sometimes they say, we're not going to change the price, but we are open to your suggestions and options and opinions, and they demonstrate that in their response. And then we'll take the time to, of course, showcase that this is the hourly price, but there's so many components that are behind the scenes that should be considered. Again, it's selling in the RFP process. It doesn't always go well, but sometimes it does.
Excellent. One of the, I think probably answered it. If you're getting the sense that this is a pricing kind of RFP that people are wanting, if you're a value-based offer, then I guess you just don't go after those. And tell me a little bit more about, it seems a lot of the game is played even before you put the proposal in, right? So knowing that they've got an RFP, knowing all the decision makers and the stakeholders as well, or How do you find that from a sales perspective? Who are the people that you tend to need to get on the team?
So in our case, for us, we definitely, all you have is one single buying authority, contracting authority, and sometimes it's not even a name. It's like a generic email address. So we really have no idea who's there behind the scenes, but we have a good sense of it. And again, we'll sell in the question period and in the response period, and we'll name drop, not personal names, but departments, buyers, users, and we'll mention similarities of scope, of project, this type of approach was used in this area and worked well. It really is a tricky salesy process in the response, and you expect these things to play a factor behind the scenes at the evaluation table.
So, and I guess some last questions, open question to anyone that wants to talk into it. I've seen how big these proposals are. I sort of gave my kind of 2 cents on some ways that I've found to at least increase the legwork. Anyone got any ideas on how do you get efficient at doing these RFPs?
Notice nobody has an answer.
I'm noticing it because I've seen some of the questions. I'm like, oh, this is so like the other one, but I can totally understand why you're asking me this question, because not quite, and they've asked this peculiar aspect of this peculiar requirement. It sounds like
I find it eerie how similar we are. We have different markets, different industries, different geographies, and how similar and challenging this is. I'm not the one to talk because we don't have actual dedicated what are they called? Sometimes it's really a dedicated role that all they do is seek out RFPs. We don't have that, and we don't use technology enough. So we need to be, if this is going to be our bread and butter going forward. And there's a case to be made for, RFP consulting around all those parameters and how to set it up. It sounds like throw all of us into a room and build that out.
That's right. That's right. Well, I wish you all the best. We're going to wrap up our time here together. I really appreciate it. You've really answered very generously, so thank you so much. Check them out on LinkedIn. We've got Jeremy Frohlich, COO of LRDG. We have Federico Espinosa, VP of Learning Design and Content Operations at Busuu, Chegg Service, and Inigo Lopez, the CEO of BiCortex. My name is Alex Asher. I'm the CEO of LearnCube, and I really thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully see you at the next Language Leaders Live. Thanks again. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.